It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, but what happened to Ruby and William will shock you. A peaceful walk home turned into a nightmare when they were attacked and humiliated by firefighters for no reason other than their race. Stay with us to the end of this story of injustice and resilience, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. The evening air was still as Ruby and her husband William made their way home. Ruby, a 72-year-old retired nurse, navigated the cracked sidewalks with quiet determination, her cane tapping lightly against the concrete. Her husband, William, trailed a few steps behind, his slow pace the result of a lingering injury from years of hard labor. They had spent the afternoon visiting friends and now looked forward to a peaceful evening at home. The neighborhood they traversed was familiar, but far from welcoming. Though Ruby and William had lived in the area for decades, the predominantly white community had never truly accepted them. Subtle acts of exclusion and occasional outright hostility were part of their daily lives, yet they carried themselves with dignity, refusing to let prejudice define them. As the sky darkened, Ruby noticed a shortcut leading through a side street near the local fire station. She paused, considering the path. It was poorly lit and uneven, but it would save them nearly 15 minutes. Turning to William, she called out, "Let's take the shortcut. It'll get us home quicker." William, struggling with his footing, gestured for her to go ahead. "You take it. I'll catch up," he said, his voice steady but tired. Ruby hesitated but nodded, gripping her cane tightly as she stepped into the quiet street. The sound of her footsteps echoed faintly in the stillness. She had taken this route before and felt no reason to worry. As she passed the fire station, the dim glow of its overhead lights illuminated a group of firefighters gathered outside. Their laughter and boisterous conversation filled the air as they finished what appeared to be a training drill. Ruby kept her eyes forward, intent on walking past unnoticed, but the laughter faded as the men noticed her. A few exchanged glances, and Ruby felt their stares settle on her like an oppressive weight. She quickened her pace, hoping to avoid any confrontation. "Hey, lady," one of them called out, his tone laced with mockery. "You lost or something?" Ruby stopped briefly, clutching her cane, and turned to face them. "No, thank you. I'm just heading home," she replied politely but firmly. The firefighter, a tall man with a cruel smirk, stepped closer. His companions chuckled and followed. "This isn't the kind of place for someone like you to be wandering round," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Ruby's heart quickened, but she stood her ground. "I've lived here for over 30 years. I know exactly where I am." The man's smirk widened as he glanced back at his friends. "You hear that, boys? She's got it all figured out." His words elicited a chorus of laughter from the group. Before Ruby could respond, another firefighter, younger but no less arrogant, stepped forward. "Maybe we should help her find her way. Can't have her getting into trouble out here." Ruby took a small step back, her grip tightening on her cane. "I don't need any help. Please, just let me pass." The group's demeanor shifted from playful to menacing. They surrounded her, cutting off her path. The tall firefighter leaned in closer, his eyes cold. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and threatening. "People like you need to know their place." Ruby felt a surge of indignation but kept her tone steady. "I just want to get home. Please step aside." The man's smirk returned, and he motioned to a fire hose coiled nearby. "Oh, we'll let you go," he said, his tone now laced with cruelty. "But first, let's cool you off a bit." One of his companions grabbed the hose, uncoiling it with a sinister grin. Ruby's eyes widened as she realized their intent. "Don't you dare!" she exclaimed, her voice rising with defiance, but her words only seemed to embolden them. The firefighter aimed the hose at her and released a powerful jet of freezing water. The force struck Ruby with such intensity that she stumbled backward, barely managing to stay upright. Her cane clattered to the ground as the icy torrent soaked her from head to toe. The men laughed uproariously, their jeers echoing in the night. "How's that for knowing your place?" one of them shouted. Ruby gasped for air, shielding her face with her hands as the water continued to pummel her. The freezing spray left her trembling, her body aching from the sheer force. She struggled to maintain her balance, but the slippery pavement beneath her feet offered no support. With a sudden jolt, she fell, landing hard on her side. "Stop this!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Please, stop!" But her pleas were met with more laughter. One firefighter turned to his companions and said mockingly, "Look at her, a drowned rat thinking she can just walk through here like she owns the place." Ruby tried to push herself up, but the relentless stream of water pinned her down. Her soaked clothing clung to her skin, and the cold seeped into her bones. She felt a mix of humiliation and fury, the blatant cruelty of the man cutting deeper than the physical pain. As the water finally ceased, Ruby lay on the wet pavement, gasping for breath. The men loomed over her, their expressions smug. "Next time, stay in your lane," the tall firefighter sneered before tossing the hose aside. Through the haze of her pain and humiliation, Ruby heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was William, his footsteps quickening as he approached. Her heart sank with both relief and dread. If they had done this to her, what would they do to him? As William reached her side and knelt to help her, the firefighters turned their attention to him. Their laughter resumed, this time tinged with the anticipation of further cruelty. The sound of William's cane tapping against the pavement grew louder as he approached the scene. His heart clenched at the sight of his wife, Ruby, sprawled on the wet ground, her clothes soaked and clinging to her frail frame. He quickened his pace despite the sharp pain in his knees, dropping his cane as he knelt beside her. "Ruby," he called, his voice filled with worry. "What happened? Are you all right?" Ruby coughed, struggling to sit up as water dripped from her hair and face. She began, her voice trembling. "They wouldn't let me pass. They did this." William turned his head sharply to face the group of firefighters who stood a few feet away, smirking and whispering among themselves. His hands clenched into fists as rage bubbled inside him. He had seen and experienced his share of racism in his 74 years, but this blatant cruelty left him seething. One of the firefighters, a stocky man with a shaved head, stepped forward and sneered. "Look who decided to join the party. Another one." William rose slowly, his old frame groaning with the effort. Despite his physical pain, he straightened his posture and stared down the men with a fiery determination. "How dare you lay a hand on my wife?" he demanded, his voice steady and firm. "What gives you the right to treat anyone like this?" The tall firefighter, the same one who had aimed the hose at Ruby, let out a mocking laugh. "And what are you going to do about it, old man?" he jeered. "You don't belong here any more than she does." William took a step forward, ignoring the ache in his legs. "We've lived here for decades. This is our home. You have no right to act like this." The stocky firefighter crossed his arms and scoffed. "No right. You're the ones walking around here like you own the place. Maybe it's time someone reminded you where you stand." Another firefighter, younger and with an arrogant grin, added, "Or where you should stand, at the back of the line." The men erupted into laughter, their words dripping with contempt. Ruby, still on the ground, reached for William's arm, her voice pleading. "Don't, William. They're looking for an excuse." But William couldn't ignore the injustice unfolding before him. He pointed a trembling finger at the group. "You think your uniforms make you better than us? That you can use your power to humiliate and harm people just because of the color of their skin? You're cowards." The tall firefighter's smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Cowards, huh?" he said, taking a threatening step closer. "Let's see how brave you are when you're on the ground." Before William could react, the firefighter shoved him hard in the chest. He stumbled backward, his foot slipping on the wet pavement, and fell with a heavy thud. Ruby cried out, crawling toward him despite her own pain. "Stop this!" she yelled, her voice cracking. "Leave us alone!" The firefighters ignored her. One of them grabbed the discarded hose, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Looks like we've got another one to cool off," he said. The tall firefighter barked a laugh. Why not? Maybe he needs to learn the same lesson as his wife. Without hesitation, the man turned the hose on William. The jet of freezing water hit him square in the chest, forcing him onto his back. He gasped, his hands flailing as the relentless stream pinned him to the ground. The icy spray soaked through his clothes, leaving him shivering and breathless. Ruby screamed, reaching out to shield him, but another firefighter aimed a second hose at her, pushing her back with the same merciless force. The couple lay side by side on the wet pavement, the water assaulting them from every direction as the firefighters laughed and taunted. "Look at them," one of the men sneered, "trying to act all high and mighty. Now they know what it's like to be put in their place." William struggled to lift his head, his body trembling from the cold and the pressure of the water. He managed to lock eyes with the tall firefighter, his gaze unwavering despite his weakened state. "You'll regret this," he rasped. "Every single one of you." The firefighter leaned closer, his smirk returning. "Regret? We're just getting started." As if to prove his point, he signaled to the others, and the streams of water intensified. Ruby's cries were drowned out by the roar of the hoses. Her frail frame shook as she clung to the pavement, her fingers scraping against the rough surface. A small crowd began to gather at the edge of the street, drawn by the commotion. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the onlookers as they took in the scene. Two elderly black individuals being mercilessly attacked by a group of white men in uniform. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the brutal assault. Some shouted for the firefighters to stop, but their voices were ignored. William gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He had faced many battles in his life, but this was different. This was pure, unfiltered hate, and he couldn't let it break him. Summoning every ounce of strength, he reached for Ruby's hand. Their fingers intertwined, and in that moment, they drew strength from each other. The lead firefighter noticed the small act of defiance and sneered. "Still got fight in you, huh? Let's see how long that lasts." But before he could order another blast, one of the onlookers stepped forward, shouting, "Enough! What you're doing is criminal." The firefighters hesitated, their smug expressions faltering as they turned toward the growing crowd. More people had arrived, their phones raised, their faces etched with outrage. The murmurs turned into shouts, demanding that the firefighters stop. Ruby and William, drenched and trembling, looked up at the crowd. Hope flickered in their hearts. Perhaps at last someone would listen. Perhaps justice would prevail. Ruby and William sat together on the cold, wet pavement, their bodies shivering and aching from the relentless assault. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. Murmurs of outrage turned into audible protests, and the sight of phones raised high, capturing every detail, sent a jolt of defiance through Ruby's weary heart. People were watching, bearing witness, and Ruby hoped that this time the cruelty wouldn't go unnoticed. Among the crowd, a young woman with a determined expression stepped forward. "This is disgusting," she yelled, her voice cutting through the jeers of the firefighters. "You think this is how you serve your community? Assaulting elderly people?" One of the firefighters turned to her, his smirk fading. "Mind your own business," he barked, but the young woman didn't flinch. Instead, she held her phone higher, ensuring she captured his face. "You've already ruined yourselves," she shot back. "Everyone here is watching, and you're going to answer for this." The group of firefighters exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado beginning to crack under the weight of the public scrutiny. The tall firefighter who had led the attack scowled at the crowd, but his voice wavered as he tried to regain control. "They started it. They were trespassing." "Trespassing?" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "They were just walking home. We saw what you did. You're nothing but bullies." The murmurs grew louder, and the firefighters began to back away, their smugness evaporating. The lead firefighter turned to his group and muttered something, but it was clear that their control over the situation was slipping. Ruby and William, though battered and humiliated, could see the tide turning in their favor. A few minutes later, the shrill wail of police sirens broke through the tense atmosphere. Ruby felt William's hand tighten around hers, his grip a silent reassurance as the squad cars pulled up. The flashing blue and red lights cast an eerie glow over the scene, illuminating the soaked and shivering couple, the hostile firefighters, and the angry crowd. 3 officers stepped out of the cars, their faces impassive as they surveyed the situation. The senior officer, a tall white man with a stern expression, approached Ruby and William. His gaze lingered on their disheveled appearance before turning to the group of firefighters, who now looked more nervous than defiant. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded, his tone clipped and authoritative. Before Ruby or William could answer, the lead firefighter spoke up, his voice hurried. "We were just trying to stop them from causing trouble," he said, gesturing toward the couple. They were acting suspiciously, walking through private property. "That's a lie," someone shouted from the crowd. "They didn't do anything wrong. We saw everything." The young woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward, holding up her phone. "I recorded the whole thing. They attacked this couple for no reason. You need to see this." The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced between the firefighters and the crowd. He seemed torn, his body language betraying his discomfort at the escalating situation. Finally, he nodded toward the young woman. "Show me the footage." As she handed her phone to the officer, the crowd fell silent. Ruby watched as he played the video, his face hardening with every passing second. The footage showed everything: the initial taunts, the unprovoked attack with the fire hoses, the blatant cruelty. There was no denying the truth. The officer turned to the firefighters, his voice cold. "This is unacceptable. You'll all be coming with us for questioning." The lead firefighter stepped forward, his hands raised defensively. "Wait, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," the officer interrupted. "This was an assault, plain and simple. You've crossed a line." The firefighters' protests were drowned out by the cheers and applause from the crowd. People shouted words of encouragement to Ruby and William, their support filling the air like a balm to the couple's wounded spirits. For the first time that night, Ruby felt a glimmer of hope. Another officer approached Ruby and William, crouching down to their level. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone softer than his colleagues. "Do you need medical attention?" Ruby nodded weakly. "We're hurt," she admitted, "but we'll manage." "We'll have paramedics take a look at you," the officer assured her, "and we'll need to take your statements." William, his voice hoarse but steady, added, "They need to face justice for this. No more excuses." The officer nodded solemnly. "They will, I promise." As the firefighters were led away in handcuffs, the crowd erupted into a mix of applause and angry shouts. The once arrogant men now looked small and defeated, their bravado replaced by shame. Ruby watched them go, her body aching, but her resolve stronger than ever. The paramedics arrived shortly after, wrapping Ruby and William in blankets and helping them into an ambulance. As they were tended to, Ruby overheard snippets of conversations outside. The crowd was still buzzing with outrage, and the videos were already making their way onto social media. "We're not letting this go," someone said. "They've gotten away with this for too long." Ruby turned to William, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "It's not over," she whispered. "They'll try to protect them. They always do." William squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll fight," he replied. "We'll fight with everything we have." The ambulance doors closed, and as they were driven away, Ruby allowed herself a moment to rest. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the community standing behind them. Ruby and William sat in the sterile white of the hospital waiting room, their bodies still trembling from the shock of the evening. Ruby's hands rested on her lap, fingers gripping the blanket the paramedics had wrapped around her. William sat beside her, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. The nurses had been kind, their voices soft as they checked for injuries, but Ruby knew kindness wouldn't erase what had been done. She glanced at William, his face pale but resolute. He had always been her pillar of strength, and tonight was no different. They hadn't spoken much since arriving, the weight of their shared experience pressing down on them like a heavy fog. The television in the corner of the room played the evening news, its volume low, but the images on the screen drew Ruby's attention. Grainy cell phone footage of the attack filled the frame. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw herself on the wet pavement, struggling to rise under the relentless force of the water. The footage cut to the firefighters being led away in handcuffs, their faces stoic but their shame evident. A reporter's voiceover spoke of outrage, of demands for accountability. The hospital door swung open, and a police officer entered. His uniform was crisp, his expression neutral as he approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he began, addressing them formally, "we need your statements regarding what happened tonight." Ruby straightened slightly, ignoring the ache in her back. "They didn't just attack us," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They humiliated us. They tried to break us because of who we are." The officer nodded, pulling out a notepad. "I understand. We've reviewed the footage, and it's clear this was an unprovoked assault. I want to assure you that we are treating this matter seriously." William leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Are you? Or is this just another case where they'll get a slap on the wrist and be back at work in a week? We've seen it happen too many times." The officer's expression didn't waver. "I can't speak to the outcome, but I can promise a thorough investigation. Your cooperation will help ensure justice is served." Ruby and William recounted the events, their voices intertwining as they relived the nightmare. Ruby spoke of the initial taunts, the smugness in the firefighters' faces. William described the physical pain, the weight of the water pinning him to the ground. They spoke of the crowd that had gathered, the voices that had risen in their defense, and the glimmers of hope amidst the cruelty. When they finished, the officer closed his notepad and looked at them, his tone softer. "Thank you. I'll make sure your statements are added to the case file. And I'm sorry this happened to you. No one should have to endure this." He left, and Ruby felt a flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. Statements were words, and words alone wouldn't bring justice. By morning, the events of the previous night had ignited a firestorm. The footage of the attack spread across social media, shared thousands of times. Comments poured in, some expressing outrage and solidarity, others dismissing the incident or even defending the firefighters. Ruby scrolled through the posts on her phone, her stomach churning at the polarized reactions. William stood by the window, looking out at the city that suddenly felt smaller and more hostile. The governor's office released a statement condemning the firefighters' actions and promising swift action. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering their support and resources. Protesters began to gather outside the fire station, their voices rising in chants demanding accountability. By the afternoon, Ruby and William were approached by a local attorney, a young black woman named Angela Davis, who had seen the footage and was determined to help. Sitting across from them in their modest living room, Angela's voice was firm. "What happened to you is unacceptable. This isn't just about you. It's about every black person who's been told they don't belong, who's been humiliated and attacked just for existing. I want to take this case, not just to get you justice, but to set a precedent." William hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Do you think we stand a chance? They'll fight this. They'll have lawyers, and they'll try to spin it." Angela's expression didn't falter. "They'll try. But the world saw what they did. We have the footage, the witnesses, and the truth. That's more than they can handle." Ruby reached for William's hand, her voice quiet but firm. "We can't let them get away with this. Not again. Not this time." The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and hearings. The firefighters, now suspended from duty, faced formal charges of assault and abuse of authority. The legal battle was grueling, with their defense team painting Ruby and William as instigators, claiming the firefighters had acted in self-defense. But the footage told a different story, a story of unprovoked cruelty and systemic racism. The courtroom was packed during the trial, with community members, activists, and reporters filling every seat. Ruby and William sat side by side, their presence a powerful reminder of the human cost of hate. Angela presented the case with precision, her voice unwavering as she detailed the events of that night. Witnesses testified, their accounts corroborating Ruby and William's story. The footage played on a large screen, the room falling silent as the brutal reality unfolded before their eyes. The verdict was a turning point. The firefighters were found guilty, their sentences reflecting the severity of their actions. But for Ruby and William, justice was more than punishment. It was a call for change. The fire department announced new policies, including mandatory sensitivity training and stricter oversight of its employees. Other public service institutions followed suit, implementing similar reforms. Ruby and William became symbols of resilience, their story inspiring others to speak out against injustice. They attended community meetings, shared their experience, and advocated for systemic change. Their voices joined a growing chorus demanding accountability and equality. One evening, as they walked through their neighborhood, they passed the fire station where it all began. The building stood quiet, its lights dimmed, but the echoes of that night lingered in Ruby's mind. She looked at William, her hand tightening around his. "We've come so far," she said softly. William nodded, his gaze steady. "But there's still work to do." They continued down the street, their steps slow but determined. The pain of that night had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into purpose. Together, they had turned their suffering into a movement, a beacon of hope for a community long silenced by fear. As they reached their home, Ruby paused, looking back at the street behind them. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time she felt the weight of possibility. They weren't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Ruby and William sat together on their porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over their neighborhood. The evening air carried a sense of peace that had eluded them for weeks. Though their bodies still bore the marks of that terrible night, their spirits had transformed. What began as a nightmare had turned into a movement, a call for justice that resonated far beyond their small community. The changes they fought for were beginning to take root. The firefighters involved in their assault had been held accountable, but more importantly, their story had sparked a wave of reform. Public institutions were implementing stricter policies to prevent abuse of power, and communities were uniting to demand transparency and fairness. As Ruby looked out at the street, now filled with a sense of safety she hadn't felt in years, she turned to William, her voice steady. "We've done something good, haven't we?" William smiled, his hand covering hers. "We've shown them that they can't silence us. And that's just the beginning." Their journey was far from over, but they were ready to keep pushing, to keep fighting for a future where no one would endure what they had. Together, they had proven that even in the face of cruelty, dignity, and resilience could prevail. If Ruby and William's story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Together, we can make a difference and stand against injustice wherever it exists.